Hi, my name's Rob. I'm part of the team. We are Raybel Charters, and we're going to restore the sailing barge Raybel and go back into the sail cargo business. Let me show you around. Here we are in the cruise accommodation. It'll normally be full of all the rigging, running rigging, spare rigging, anchor chain that you're seeing on the quayside coming down here. And these are the berths. They're really quite simple, one each side. And there would have been a kind of pot-belly stove here where they would have done all their cooking and making of the tea. And this is the major part of the restoration where the oil is going to go. This is going to be pulled apart and put back together and hopefully not lose too much of its original character. And then coming through here, it's a sort of conversion into a charter vessel. We have heads, bathroom, shower, water tanks. Walking underneath the sailing deck, some of the original oakum falling down to the gaps in the planking there. And then through into the main hold of the vessel where the hatches would be lifted off and the cargo lowered in, be it timber, hand loaded or grain coming in on a conveyor belt and then taken out with a grab. And a lot of the sort of history of the cargo is still sort of reflected in it. I'm going to call it the floor. It's actually called the ceiling of the barge as it seals the hold, and it's cut up and dug up with marks where men have been shoveling and crane grabs have been grabbing, and over the 100 or so years that she's been around. This would have in fact been the master's cabin, although there's nothing in here now. But this space will be reimagined for the restoration. We'll be researching, hopefully finding some original photographs and possibly putting it back as it was, because it was a particularly fine cabin.
So this is Matthew. Can you just tell me about your connection to Raybel, please?
Yes, my parents bought Raybel from the original owners, the Sully small shipping company, the Sully family, in the early 70s, and the barge was still carrying cargo in those days.
So before we kind of talk more about the restoration work in here, what was this area formerly used for?
Well, called the forecastle, shortened from forecastle, but forecastle is the way it's always pronounced. In very simple terms, this is where the crew lived, as in not the skipper, but it would be the mate and the third hand.
What will be the main bulk of restoration work that will happen within this area?
Well, actually in here is the most complex and very time-consuming job, because all these, they're oak timbers about 6 inches square, all shaped. They're called the frames, and they start absolutely level with the deck and run down between the planking and the lining and right through under this floor, which is the bilge, goes into the bilge, and they meet the keelson, which is the main backbone that runs through. So that framework, piece by piece, will be replaced. And as I say, it is the most skilled, especially where everything's meeting up in the bilges. And this is the forward bulkhead. And from here, right back to the far bulkhead, was the cargo space. So when this was loaded with, say, 150 tonnes of wheat, often loose, that would be up to the top of the hatchboards. And all these hatchboards, they still lift off. Just as I mean, we've got a few electrics there, but you unhook things, you can lift the whole top off, kind of like a cabriolet, the car. When you have a boat which by its nature will flex, the whole hull will flex, because you can imagine with 150 tonnes inside as well, and in a big sea, part of their strength is that they can move slightly. They were built with a good life of 25 years of hard work, so it's worth remembering that, though, when you look at how well they've lasted, really. And you think this is 100 years old, and yes, it needs a lot of work, but it's still remarkable, yeah, for the time it's gone through. Well, we're now in the main hold, and during the restoration there's not a great deal that's being replaced here. The lining and inwale and beams are largely original, and especially the iron beams, they're good order. But there are a few smaller jobs, as in this piece of inwale, where it's the scarf joint is, original from the 20s again. That will be cut back to where they find it's good, and a length of possibly 30 feet replaced inside. And here is a feature that you don't see on many barges. It's actually a stage, just an old-fashioned stage, made in 6 sections. It lifts out very easily. But in the 90s, when I was managing the barge, I discovered that it was one thing to take, say, 12 people or whatever for a week's sail, which I'd grown up, you know, kind of learning that. But for 6 months of the year, all through the winter, the barge is sat there, and any money that you can earn, that's one thing, to help with maintenance is a help. But also it is a fantastic venue to be enjoyed. First I put the stage in for college experimental theatre things, and then we carried that on doing cabaret, other plays, acoustic music events and that kind of thing. So being removable was good, because if someone wanted to use the barge for a dinner they could, or you could put the stage in and do something a bit theatrical with it.
Such a great entertainment space.
Yeah, and it rolls off into this project perfectly, because there will be all kinds of events being held in here.
So Matt, shall we have a look in the skipper's cabin?
Yes, absolutely. So this is the skipper's cabin, but now dominated by the engine. So it tends to be called the engine room for obvious reasons. This is the second engine the barge had. It went in the 62, Gardner, the Rolls-Royce of diesels, so it's been rebuilt and we're looking after it. The skipper's cabin originally, the bulkhead was down here, wooden bulkhead, and I've had descriptions from skippers that remember the original before the engine, which was in the 30s. So here was a big table, there were locker seats and a bunk either side, and there was a door here into a little wash area, and then the steps up. But by all accounts, a very splendid affair, because the owner it was kind of the pride of the Surrey fleet, the first owners, and so they had a very beautiful skylight, and this was really family accommodation when they took the barge on holiday each summer.
She's a timber construction, largely of oak and pitch pine, and she's nearly 100 years old, so some of that timber's really starting to show its age, and we're going to be pulling her apart and replacing some of those timbers.
How much of Raybel will be original, and then how much will be new?
Well, she's going to be restored sympathetically. We're going to be maintaining or retaining as much original fabric as we can.
So, what's under the cover, Rob?
Well, this is the forecastle hatch frame. It's based on the original one. Should we take the cover off?
Yeah.
The original one was made from a pitch pine, but it's been remade in teak. It's showing a little age, but this will all clean up, and we'll shoot on for many more years.
So this is the main feature that people can see from quite far, isn't it, Rob?
Yeah, but the mast and the top mast are nearly 100 feet tall.
And what are they made of?
These are steel, and these are relatively recent. The original would have been made out of timber. In fact, the spreet was made from the turned down from an old mast from a man of war, so it would have been possibly a couple hundred years old, a piece of wood.
Fantastic. Wow. And these can also be lowered, can't they, in order to get into the bridge?
Yeah, that's right. They're lowered down on the windlass that we were looking at earlier.
And do all Thames sailing barges have lowered masts?
Yeah, they all have that ability. Yeah.
Oh, that looks like a fun job, Rob.
Yeah, well, being in the mud's all part of barge life, eh? And here we go. Oh.
So what are you looking at there?
A closer examination, although the Raybel's rudder doesn't look too bad, she's had many, many repairs over the years, and she's due for replacement as well.
So what's the rudder made out of, Rob?
It's made out of oak. It's actually made out of several pieces, Faye, and then these are joined together with these steel bands. Up under the cover there, Faye, is the steering gear that's turning the top of the rudder and steering the barge.
And how will you get this out to restore?
Because it's so heavy, we're going to wait till we get into the dry dock and going to crane it off there.
Is that the propeller there, Rob?
That is. That's Raybel's propeller.
Wow.
Ah, nice to be out of the mud.
June Iris Nethersall, previously maiden name Eastland. My father's name was George Frederick Eastland, and he was a bargeman right from a young boy. He ran away from home when he was 14, and he'd been to the other side of the world before his mother knew where he was. And when he came home, he was come home on a 4-masted schooner. From then on, he was in barges for the rest of his life until he died. And I was brought up on barges because my mother died when I was 7. So therefore, all school holidays I had to spend with my father on the barges. I wasn't treated like a girl, I was treated like a boy. Upsail, topsail, mainsail, foresail, mizzen, all the names of the sails I had to know because I had to help pull them up on ropes. When you coiled the ropes, which I had to do, they had to be done like that on the hatches. And if the weather was going to be rough, then the boat, little rowing boat, what they towed, was brought on to the barge, and because there was, don't know what to say, that they was called the rollocks. The rollocks, where they placed the barge, and if the weather was very rough, then my father used to put me in that rowing boat and put a tarpaulin over me because of the water coming up because it was so rough. And I wouldn't have missed it for the world because it gave me a lot of interesting things. I know he was my father, but I don't think there was another bargeman compared to him.
No,
he was very strict. He's very particular about his barges. I mean, he used to have one of those big brass things where the wheel was, and that had to be cleaned every day. He used to carry straw at Rhythm Dock, that was his paper mill. He used to carry sugar, maize, wheat, paper, from the paper mill to take up to the London docks, which was going to the news of the world and the big paper places. My father would never take coal. His barge was immaculate. Now I'll tell you one about the straw. He loaded straw in Ipswich, and when they loaded it, it was up so high that he couldn't see up forward. So I had to sit on the top of the straw and guide him all the way to Rhythm Dock, where the straw was bound for. He used to like to do fishing. So therefore, just off Whitstable, there's a big sandbank. So he used to moor the barge, and when the tide went out, he was high and dry on this sand. And he could pick up cockles, whelks and oysters off of there, and he used to have bucket loads of them. And he was a deep sea bargeman, so therefore he could wear the Merchant Navy badge. And he won the Thames barge race 3 years running. I couldn't tell you the name of the barges that he was on, but there was the Carina, there was the Valdora, there was the Trilby, and the last one he had was the Convoy, which was owned by Sully's of London. Mm-hmm. He used to go up to Fenchurch Street, where Sully's offices was. He would go up there sometimes to pick his money up, to find out what cargoes he had, because if they said you got coal, he wouldn't do it. And of course he used to take me, and when I used to go into the office, Mr. Sully used to sit me on his knee and give me sweets.
This is Kevin Nethersall. I'm grandson of George Eastland. My link to Raybel is that my mum, June Nethersall, was invited down when the Raybel was brought up to Milton Creek in October or late 2019. And I brought mum down because of her knowledge of barges. Friends of hers knew that she'd spent time on the barges. And while I was here, I got talking to Mark. We went over saw the barge. Got talking to Mark Allinson, who's the project manager of it. And he said he was looking for volunteers. Well, I said to Mark at the time, I'd be happy to volunteer, but I'd spent 40 odd years sitting in an office in London working for Lloyd's of London, and I may not have the relative skills they wanted. And he said he was looking for enthusiastic people to help out. So I'll come down. I'll help out 1 day a week on the Raybel, helping out the shipwrights, make sure they've got gear to get the work they've got to do, and various other activities. I'll help machine the deck planks on the Raybel. We prepared all the deck planks to a chap called Roger Whaley, who I worked with on the barge, and we've made a lantern hatch at the back of the barge. So I come down 1 day a week helping out. But while I've been down here, I've been doing my own research into the Raybel where I can. And there was a family history of ours, is that my granddad sunk his barge, the Convoy, in 1955 in Yarmouth.
He's going into Yarmouth Harbour.
This is 1955?
Yes, yep. And it was a very rough day. And then first of all, he said, no, I'm not going to do it. And then, of course, he said, yes, I will. And it was going into Yarmouth Harbour that a big wave, took the barge and banged it up against the side, and it sank.
So you said he was a bit of a daredevil. So
he was a bit of a daredevil.
What did you mean by that? Would he take risks to get the job done?
Oh, I can't tell you what he used to say. Yeah, as I say, he spent time in hospital then in Great Yarmouth.
And I wanted to find out a little bit more about that. So I did a bit of research. I've got some photographs of the barge being sunk that have been provided to me. But I was a bit intrigued as to actually what did happen. So I was on holiday up in Norfolk, and I went to Norwich Library and asked them if they had copies of the Eastern Standard Press that was issued around about the time. And luckily they did, on microfilm. I went through the microfilm and found clippings of it. And to my surprise, at the time that my granddad was sailing into Yarmouth Harbour, he was in convoy with the Raybel, and the Raybel helped rescue my granddad and his mate off the barge and get some of their belongings off the barge and help get the Raybel more secure in Yarmouth Harbour so that she could be saved. My granddad spent the night at the Seamen's Mission in Yarmouth, but also he contacted the Sully family, obviously, to inform them what had happened, because the Raybel and the Convoy, which was my granddad's barge, were owned by the Sully family.
This beautiful white chrysalis made of the finest plastic tarpaulin is from whence our beautiful Raybel will emerge. It's basically an old rubbish lighter that's been converted into a dry dock. It's been extended on one side, and then there's blocks inside that Raybel was floated onto. Hoops were welded over the top, the tarpaulin cover was pulled over the top, and then inside we put a staging round so we could get to the sides of Raybel. So twice a day the tide comes up and goes down again. So you pick a day when you've got a very high tide, you take the dry dock to the deepest part of the water you can find, and you sink her. She sinks. And when the tide comes in, the water fills the dry dock up, and the dry dock stays on the bottom. Meanwhile, Raybel is floating on the high tide, and you bring Raybel and you position it over the dry dock in exactly the right place. How do they do that? I don't know. And then the tide starts going down, Raybel goes down, and she lands perfectly with inches to spare on the blocks. And when all the water's flowed out of the dry dock, you close the valves, and 12 hours later the water comes up again, and in theory, and in practice this time, thank goodness, the whole shebang floats.
That sounded like it must have been a pretty nerve-wracking day.
Well, the shipwrights were confident, but there were so many opportunities for disaster. If the dry dock wasn't deep enough and Raybel had got caught halfway in, that would have snapped her in half. If she'd gone in and the weight of everything was in the wrong place and the dry dock hadn't floated. And then, of course, you've got to make sure that the whole thing floats before Raybel actually starts swirling around on the tides. So big ropes, getting them all tied in exactly the right position. A lot of experienced people knowing what they were doing, basically.
Okay, so if we're going to take you through now, we're going to introduce Tim, who is the lead shipwright.
What we've got here is a rotten barge. What we're trying to do is we're trying to achieve a barge that isn't rotten.
Good.
You want it to float?
Yeah, we want it to float. When we first dry docked the barge, we found that the bow, due to lack of strength and rot, was starting to drop off. So initially what we did was we jacked the barge back into shape. We then systematically replaced these floors and futtocks here, and at the same time we're obviously renewing the frames that work off of them. Up forward we're going to leave these 3 frames here which are deemed to be in good condition low down. We're obviously going to replace the tops of them. We're also going to be replacing the apron, which is the piece of timber right up forward, which basically holds all the plankings together. Historically, they would have what was known as a grown wooden knee in place of these steel knees. Now, it's terribly difficult to get hold of good quality oak anyway, and to get hold of a good quality bit of oak that's good enough to use for that knee is nearly impossible today, which is why we've put the steels in there, because it gives an incredible amount of strength, and we can shape and fabricate those in position.
My father, Ian Houston, got involved. He was born in Gravesend, and from his bedroom window could see the Thames. This is in the mid-30s, 1930s, so there were still sailing barges working in those days, and they obviously captured his imagination, and his plan really was to gradually make painting his means of making a living. So when I was 3 years old, in '64, we moved to Norfolk, which is the place he particularly wanted to paint. And we'd go to see tall ships races, steam engines, there's all that kind of thing was what I think Dad was particularly fascinated by. We used to go to Pin Mill a lot, where we'd see the various barges that were there. And he had got to know Reuben Webb, who ran Webb's yard at Pin Mill. And Reuben had obviously got to know Dad well enough to know that he was looking for a sailing barge, but he warned him off anything that came up for sale and said, there's 2 barges owned by Sulleys, still in trade, the Raybel and the Phoenician. And he said, well, one of those comes up for sale, I'll let you know. And then one day, I think the phone must have gone, and Reuben said to Dad that the Raybel's up for sale. And the first I knew, at the age of 12, I'm sure it was still Fenchurch Street, the Sully's office. And I remember sitting in a big room with dark panelling, and it would have been Raymond Sully there. And papers were signed, I was sitting there wide-eyed. And in fact, the phone went, and Raymond put his hand over the receiver, having chatted for a minute, and he said to Dad, if you want to make a quick buck, I've got Bell's Whiskey on the phone, and they want to buy Raybel. And Dad shook his head, and the Raybel was sold to him. Anyway, we then must have made our way from Fenchurch Street to Silvertown, which is where the Raybel was moored. And I remember looking down, it's been about a 30-foot drop to the barge sat on the mud at Silvertown. So we set off anyway that afternoon from the berth at Silvertown. The plan being just to go through, I guess it would have been an early evening arrival at Pin Mill was the plan. Reuben seemed to know, he obviously knew barges inside out, but he was totally at home with the Raybel, it would seem. But I remember we must have been in Sea Reach, and there was quite a swell running, to put it mildly. Probably the biggest sea, when I look back, probably the biggest sea I ever punched into, because there were waves. If you think the Raybel's light with that huge bow, there were waves breaking over the bow, smashing onto the forehatch, and running down the side decks. And I remember we were in the wheelhouse, and I remember Reuben turned to me and he said, "That's what they call shipping it green, boy."
How old were you when this
I was 12.
12.
So
Wow.
it was just a normal
What an
day.
adventure. Wow.
But after a bit of that, he said, "Well, I don't think we want to spend the night doing this." So we turned and ran back into Queenborough. I remember it must have been getting late in the day, kind of dusk, I would have thought. But put the barge boat in the water, which was sat on the hatch. And of course it hadn't been in the water for months probably, so the water was pouring into it. I sat there with a baler, throwing water out as fast as I could, as Dad and Reuben rowed to the pontoon. And I sat there for an hour or so while they went to the shops and begged and got whatever food they could, because we had virtually nothing. And anyway, that night we rummaged around on deck, and I remember finding some bits of damp canvas, and in the forecastle on the Raybel was a kind of steel framed, I think they call them cots, and it folded down and hung on a couple of chains from the side. And Dad and I slept on this one kind of rusty old cot in the forecastle, and Reuben went down in the stern cabin, and early that morning he reappeared. We'd not had much of a night really, in the damp and cold, but it's all very exciting. And we spent the day there. I think the wind was still howling, so we spent the day there, and probably quite a good thing, because I got to walk around the barge and got to hear Reuben talking about everything. My sister and mother had gone to Pin Mill expecting us there the previous evening. So phone call, in those days, of course, a phone call had to be made from the pay box, on the land. So they must have been warned that we were going to be a day or two late. And anyway, yeah, we got there a day or two late.
assume the dad's is down below, is it?
One thick outer wire.
going or?
Start boarding something. We'll go a little more. Let that wedge come out a little bit, can you please?
What do you need? The big one and the medium.
Very nice.
Yeah, I'm here.
Smells lovely as well.
Yeah, here.
Enjoying this, James?
Yeah, quite therapeutic.
Oh, that's good. You've already been stranded aboard today.
It's a very labour-intensive job, isn't it? This cool.
It is.
Sorry?
When did you last do this?
I'm trying to think. I was only on one ship that had wooden deck, and that would have been about 1970. About 50 years ago.
Very nice.
There was a man that, in fact, I think Dad first sailed with, called Richard Duke, and he was always finding barges. He was in fact a farmer and had a farm just inland from Pin Mill. He had the convoy, I think it was from Sully's, it had been squashed between two ships. All the iron beams on the inside had been bent. And he had a brilliant idea. So he bought the barge for a few £100 and went down with a gas axe, cut through the beams, and the barge sprang back to shape. So he got himself quite a bargain. And he and his family sailed up to Scotland with it was either a Mini or a Morris Minor in the main hold. And when they got to some interesting place, they'd use the Spreet to lift the car out, drive around the highlands and highlands of the west coast. And
Wonderful.
there seemed to be quite a lot of that kind of imaginative family barging going on in those days, because a barge could be bought from trade still in quite good condition, and with barges really costing probably less than someone would spend if they wanted a yacht. I know that Mum, looking back, she said, you know, that the barge for a family did work very well. I mean, I was, by nature, I think, it was immediately caught my imagination. Most teenage boys probably it would do that, really. I mean, my thing as well was I'd become the kind of sanctuary for birds and animals of the local area. So quite often a trip down there would mean taking the injured gull in a box. I had a jackdaw that I'd hand reared from a chick, so the jackdaw would be sat on the deck. I had a grass snake, I remember, for a year or so.
Good Lord.
Arabian spiny mice. When I actually think, you know, Mum and Dad would have loaded these creatures into the car, carry all this across a bit of mud, up a ladder, all the creatures would be put in the forecastle, where Sarah and I had a bunk either side. In fact, Sarah and I spent one night, I think it was a hamster that I had. It was a big European hamster that had escaped from a cage.
Of course.
And then I could see him, but you just couldn't. I was crawling around in the bilge and couldn't get at him. And then in the chain locker, you could see his nose appear, and he was starting to gnaw at the bottom of the chain locker. So I got a bread knife, and Sarah and I took it in turns. We would have been, 13 and 15 or something like that. We took it in turns with the bread knife. One of us had to push him away and keep him away somewhere with a stick, and the other would carve a bit out the bottom of the wood with the bread knife till we made a big enough hole for the hamster to get out. So yeah, there were all kinds of completely unbarge related nonsense that went on. But then the Raybel, having come out of trade from Sully's, still had the load line ticket. So when Crescent Shipping contacted Dad and said, look, we've got work, you've got a barge with a ticket, if you want more work for a year or two, we've got it. So no sooner had the barge arrived at Pin Mill, and it was all great excitement, you know, because suddenly, you know, for me as a schoolboy, I had a barge to go to, and suddenly that had gone, which is not, you know, from my point of view, it wasn't so great. In Pin Mill, there's a line of old boats. It was always called Rotten Row then, because it tended to be where an old barge or boat would be put. So there are quite a few families that lived down Rotten Row. And one of the barges was called Asphodel. And an ex-barge skipper, or a barge skipper, and his wife, Doug and Eileen Bridges, lived on a barge called Asphodel. Well, I think it would have been Reuben that had seen the opportunity, and he said, well, if you go, or we go, looking for leeward winches, masts, all the wire work, levers, etc., it's going to start getting expensive and time consuming. The Asphodel is for sale for not much. Buy that. When the Raybel's out of service, I'll transfer the gear from Asphodel to Raybel, and that'll be the cheapest option, I think, was the main thing. And it was all very neat, because Doug and Eileen, Doug being the barge skipper, they went as skipper and mate on Raybel, and their barge Asphodel became our kind of summer retreat, really, while the Raybel was out working. And I remember Doug and Eileen had a full-size poodle and a Alsatian, and Doug Bridges chain smoked. I mean, literally lit one from the other. His wife was, liked to look good, so she would quite often be tottering around in high heels. It was all a very eccentric sight. And Dad would quite often nip down and see how things were going, or do whatever he had to do. You know, he'd come back often swearing, saying, well, I'd just sit ashore, because of course the two dogs wouldn't let him on board. He'd turn up at Rochester or something and get across in a boat, and then couldn't get on deck because there'd be an Alsatian and a poodle growling at him, you know. So It was all an eccentric time, but...
Is it right down up Forest Dock? Right on.
Slightly up, so you do it down.
But I do know someone, and it's not a lot.
Yep. Yeah, I guess you can, mate, yeah. Okay, so I would just drill that and screw there. Yeah, and then these are 3-inch screws. And you do the same up here, and just get it glued up, and then tomorrow morning you put the road up fastened. So, Josh, you're in charge this week, eh, mate?
My dad, he was a skipper. He used to go Ipswich, up round as Great Yarmouth, right up as round as far as the Wash, down as far as Cornwall, Dover. I know he won the Thames Barge Race 3 years running. And my dad had a barge called the Valdora and the Carina. Well, I lived on one for about 3 years when we got bombed out in Grays, Essex. And that was called the Oceanic, which was a 150-ton iron barge. Well, I played about on the hatches and running around the barge all the time. They had to keep their eye on me in case I went up to the side. I was just treated like a boy. I mean, I had to learn how to scull a boat, I had to learn how to rope up. And after he got his cargo, he was very particular about, they used to sheet the hatchet, as they put the hatches back, sheet it up. And when you done the corners, you had to fold them in a certain way and put the bars across, and then they used to knock wedges in. They had one bunk, which was the skipper's bed, and then they had like a settee that went round the cabin for you to sit on. I used to have to sleep on that. Decks were washed down regularly. A bucket of water from over the side, they was washed down. He was very particular about his stuff.
This is a lead flashing, and it seals the joint between the comb-ins, which is this piece, and the deck, to stop any water getting in the gap which is inevitably going to be in there.
So it's really neat, and there's a lot of nails.
There's a load of nails. There's probably more money spent on nails than lead. And we cut it into 3 metre lengths because that's probably about the limit that you can handle once it's stretched out and it's folded. So we used a little jig that I made up there to fold it on.
Spacing these planks over each other and fix them onto the frames, making sure the fixings go properly into the frames. Very complicated. And another thing you want to do is that, of course, the barge, as it comes to the front, it's narrower, and then it gets broader as it gets towards the chine. So designing the planks so that they all look even and you don't end up with any funny shaped planks is quite a skill, and they've done a fantastic job of getting the planks looking really splendid. And if we look at the front of the boat, you can see how they look perfectly even. In fact, they're all very complex shapes which the shipwrights had to spile out and work that out.
This barge comprises of 3 layers. So there's the original 2 layers which make up 3 inches, and then there's a layer of 1 1/8 from the outside of that, which is the doubling to marry up with the existing doubling that was done sometime in the 40s. Now, when it was done in the 40s, the doubling was not done in a particularly attractive way, in as much as the runs of planking didn't follow the line of the vessel. They were narrow in places and much too wide in others. So we split the area up and ensured that we got the lines of planking as they should be.
It's very elegant because it's got this sort of like lovely curve to it now, hasn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, what you'll find is that once it's all cleaned up and tarred, the lines of the planks will accentuate the shape of the barge and will make it look better.
I imagine it was about 65 or 66, and I come off the trawlers. I was decking on a trawler called Granby Queen. Keith Barber was the skipper of her, and he used to sack us every trip. But one trip I said, no, I ain't coming back, Keith. And I didn't have nowhere to go, but I got on a train and I went to Ipswich, and I was stopped in a hotel there because I had plenty of money. I'd just done nearly 3 weeks at sea, and somebody said to me, old Harold Smythe's looking for a mate on the Beatrice Maud. So I didn't know what a bloody barge was, to be quite honest. So I see him, and he gave me a job. He said, we're off down to Penmill because we're going to have all the gear out. So we took her down to Penmill and laid on the hard, and Sully's, who owned her, said, well, while you're on there, will you take the Raybel away? And I think the Raybel might be the first one we took away. Joined her at Lowestoft or at Yarmouth, I can't really remember, but it's one of them ports. She was laid there with no crew, so we went up there and picked her up and brought her back, and then started trading with her and only done a few weeks on her. But I do remember we was coming round Orford Ness because it was dark and got the compass binnacle in over the compass. And of course then there's only paraffin lights, there weren't any electric light in them, and it was a bit lumpy, and so the paraffin spilled and the bloody willows nearly went up. And we got a big searchlight from Orford Ness, and they looked at us to see if we was all right because we put it out. But honestly, the things we got up to, you wouldn't believe. Harold Smythe.
Sounds like you've come across him before.
Harold Smythe, yeah.
Have you?
The name.
A likeable rogue. Them days, you could sell old rope.
When they're saying money for old rope comes from, isn't it?
Whenever we was up in London, anything that weren't tied down, me and Harold would have. The lighters, you know, that were in the docks, they had a chain, and then they had a rope on. So we'd nick as much of that as we could. And anything we load, like grain and that, we'd nick a bag of that, and all sorts, and scrap. We'd stow all this until we got up to Yarmouth, between the forehold and the main hold, under that bit there. You'd get up to Yarmouth and you'd go and get the barrow from Kingy's, the scrap merchant, and we'd load the barrow up, and he'd say to me, just give me a push to start off, you stay aboard and I'll take this down to Kingy's, because he didn't want me to go because I'd see how much he got, you see. That's what it was all about. And then he'd come back and he'd be, oh, we got so and so for that bill, and he'd give me so much, but he probably got a lot more than that. Yeah, that's one story. Yeah, we had some laughs.
What was the sort of main freight you were carrying then?
Mostly grain, groundnut cake, animal feeds and stuff like that, yeah, mostly. Yeah. Oh, hoof and horn, bone meal, fish meal. We loaded hoof and horn once in the London dock, and then of course, depending on the weevil content, you'd get fumigated. Sometimes if you had a real big infestation of weevils then in the cargo, then they'd close the whole barge down for a couple of days. We was loading all sorts of stuff then, scrap, cullet, which is broken glass, and all grain, swarf, cement, China clay from Charlestown, cement down to the Channel Islands, and scrap back up to Brussels and stuff like that. When I was working for Mitchell's, all we were carrying were explosives.
The bottom of the barge is held onto the keelstone with big bolts, and those similar bolts go through the chine, through the sides and through the chines down to the bottom. The volunteers have been starting the process of removing those bolts. It's a lot more complicated than it seems. Some of the bolts are solid, so it's just been a matter of applying perhaps 10 tons of force with a jack and a hammers to force them down. Other bolts are withered in the middle, so in fact when you try to hammer them they just collapse in on each other. So that's no good, you have to be able to pull them out. So what we've been doing is a mixture of techniques of knocking them out slightly so we can grab hold of one end, or later on we'll be welding bits on that we can grab hold of and pulling them out like that. Using all different sorts of techniques, jacks, hammers, big drifts to drive them down. And some of them have come up beautifully easily and will be replaced easily. Others are being absolute swines and they're going to take a lot more work to get out.
Yay! Oh, that's even shorter, that one.
Yeah! Well done, Jack.
I'm just a helper on the barge. My name's Jim. I'm an ex-mechanic and I love playing with nuts, bolts and all that sort of stuff. We're trying to get under here, under this piece, the keel, there's a load of bolts and they've been in there since the barge was built, I assume. And And we've been cutting all the nuts off and driving the bolts out with a jack so that we can actually get them out as best we can.
So how long does it take you to get one of these bolts out?
These ones,
Yeah.
kill bolts you'd probably get about 4 in a day normally. Today we've got 7, but the chine bolts will be all down one bolt. So sometimes, just depends on your luck.
And how many have you got to do?
Oh, God knows, there must be loads of them. I don't know, how many kill bolts are there? 100? Must be around about 100, yeah.
The other winch on the other side, crab winch, they're handed, so they both live on the specific sides of the barge. This one had a broken foot, which we made a new foot, and the one on the other side had this bar missing, so we replaced that bar as well. When they came off of the Raybel, they were the same hand, which meant that you had to wind them, one of them in the wrong direction. Well, we changed that. I think it's the other one over this side. We moved this pull from this side to that side, and that makes the whole thing the other hand. And this, believe it or not, which slips around one of these bars, is the brake. It's a bit heat provinces, but we went for a sail on the Edith May and they do work, although this is probably one of the most dangerous bits of equipment on the whole barge.
And what about over here? This sort of like greenhouse thing that you've built?
Well, I call it a greenhouse. I think Mark calls it a lantern... A lantern hatch, there you are. Designed by Tim. Apparently is quite unique. Nothing else exists like it on any other barge. And when it's finished, it will have timber on the top and 2 opening glazed flaps on either side, which are hinged to give air down into the engine room. Across here and here will be wooden seats for spectators to sit upon, and then if we move around here, we'll have a compass, which I think you already have, seated about here. The Morse controls for the engine will be here, and inside these pieces make up a sliding hatch in the front. Inside here will be VHF radio and with the electrics and the starting mechanism for the engine.
One time they asked him if he would mind taking coal from Southend up to the dock somewhere up in London, and he done it, and there was hell to pay because it made all his hold dirty, and he had that hold washed out. I can remember that, but he only ever carried corn, wheat, sugar. He used to have sugar. You know the police, they have them little boats. They used to come alongside of my dad. I can hear them saying to them, "What are you carrying, George?" And if he said sugar, they'd say, "Right." And they'd come aboard and have a sack of sugar. He was going down that way where the oyster was, because he'd be going round to Suffolk that way, wouldn't he? Ipswich and all there. If he was coming out from the London docks with whatever he'd got, he would stop till the tide went down, and then he could get out and get his oysters. And he used to do the cockles the other side if he was going up the Thames, or if he'd been into Ridham Dock with anything. When he come out, he would moor the barge there for a while, and tie it till he got a bucket full of cockles, and he used to have to cook them, and you could hear them cockles squeaking. I must admit, it was a hard life, but from what I can remember, I wouldn't have missed it for the world.
Trading days stopped. Reuben put everything into transferring the gear from Asphodel, which happened pretty quickly really. Nothing was done down below, so the the main and forehulls, the whole barge was empty right through. I remember just a small pile of grain that had been swept into one corner. There was still the skipper's cabin aft and the forecastle with a little stove, gas stove, and a couple of cupboards. And there's a water tank on deck. That's how it had been probably since post-war days, really. It was really, I think, a summer's work, from what I remember, to get the rig changed from the Asphodel to Raybel. And Whitmore's of Ipswich, a once very busy sail loft. I think it was the last suit of sails they made. At the end of the summer of '76, we had hoped to actually get underway. And it was actually all done, and there was a problem with the engine starter, from what I remember. I was meant to be going back to school. Getting ready to leave, the engine still wouldn't start. The tide had come in and couldn't get the engine started. So Reuben said, sod it, and started shouting at us to set things and let ropes off. And in a way it couldn't have been better, because we sailed off Pinmill Hard, the first trip. There was quite a good breeze, I think, setting us on shore, from what I remember. With a bit of board down, he got away with it, you could say. And yeah, off we went, and we didn't stop. We went out of Harwich Harbour. It was September gales, I think, really, we had that week, so it was lively. And I learned a bit more of Reuben's language, which was quite interesting. He could turn the air blue. He would kind of apologise afterwards, It's kind of like, when it had all calmed down, he would say, sorry about that, boy, but I couldn't see that. I probably learnt more that week than I would have done if I'd gone to school, put it that way. Yeah, so the charters, I think primarily it might have been to do with having a little bit of income from the barge to help towards the running costs. My mother was a very social person, a real people person. She had trained as a secretary and had been a secretary in London at SOAS. She was just a good organiser and social. And Dad had, was a music teacher, but he was a good teacher, really. And so I think it was the obvious thing that they would run week or weekend courses of people who wanted to draw and paint. And he knew all the wading birds. He just was a very keen bird watcher. So for him to teach painting and bird watching, he was kind of just doing what came naturally. And my mum was good at generally organising everything and a good cook. So it was a good team. So yes, it was busy, but there were all kinds of people. It would have been, in those days, it was word of mouth, really. A typical weekend could be anchor at Butterman's Bay, which is only a mile down. Charterers might be picked up even late that night, because they'd go to the Button Oyster. I would take the barge boat back and ferry them. If there was 12, it might be a couple of trips with all their bags. The barge, there was a generator, but it was really for topping up the batteries. As you went down below with people for their week's adventure, it was just the hiss of tilly lamps, basically. If you wanted water, you undid a valve and pumped water by hand into the header tank, which then ran down into the galley or washer and tap. If you wanted a wash, there was a huge kettle on a Rayburn, so anyone wanting a wash would go into one of the washrooms, stand in a huge bowl, have their wash, and charterers quickly learned that if you cleaned your teeth and left the tap running, you were the one standing by the pump for the next 20 minutes, refilling the 50-gallon header tank. So people soon learned to economise with water. The two tanks there, they'd carried orange juice between California and London, I think. Two huge, thick, rubber-walled orange juice containers, basically, that Reuben had sourced from his dock contacts. So there was probably 3 or 4 tons of water, I'd say, in those. The best place to go was also the closest. It's only a mile or so, and you can turn into Walton Backwaters, which is just a beautiful, timeless spot it's a broad creek that runs up the centre, and there's an island. So it's an ideal barge anchorage, especially if you're interested in painting the scenery or watching the bird life. Idyllic place until it gets very windy. and then there's no no real shelter. So anything you do on a barge, you're always watching the weather. If you saw anything nasty coming, we'd be out of there and back up into Harwich.
This is a nice carving that says it's certified for the accommodation of 2 seamen. Here I have a small selection of barge tools. This is a caulking mallet or caulking hammer for driving the oakum down between the seams of the deck planking, which is then paid with a pitch. And then we serve the wires with these materials here using this tool here, and then that's then coated in a Stockholm tar. A sailmaker's palm here for pushing the needles through the rope and the canvas. We have the plumb bob because it's for finding level on the barge or on any kind of vessel, so you don't use an ordinary spirit level. A fid for splicing ropes, used to create something like the Raybel's logo to eternal rings. Steelwork is very similar to the steelwork that's incorporated into the Cutty Sark, one of our most famous ships, making a composite construction, which has indeed given her the longevity and the strength to survive to this day. But it's the timbers now that are mostly aging and they need to be replaced. Just getting through the steel bulkhead, this was put in, we think, around about the wartime. She was built without an engine, but then had an engine unit put in around 1930. And this steel bulkhead was put in at that time. I think that it's a kind of something to protect them in case there was a fire, and to separate them from some of the cargoes which could have been hazardous as well.
Push, push, push.
Hi, I'm Heike. I've just started working on Raybel, and I'm in charge of making a new rudder to the old measurement, because the old one was too knackered. And I'm also going to work with 2 or 3 trainees that we'll have here over the next 2 months. I just made a smaller rudder for a wooden barge. Same principles, just a bit smaller because the barge is smaller, so the rudder is smaller. So it's quite a nice piece of work, so it's self-contained. It's also a good means to teach basic woodworking skills, so you need to get stuff right angle, flat, and shape the wood a little bit. Yeah, so there's a bit of skill involved, so we don't know yet exactly what skill the trainees will have, so that's a nice piece of work for them to get their teeth in, and for me to supervise them, and then we'll teach them other stuff as well. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to having them here with you.
What was the kind of regulations like back then? The regulations, is it?
Don't think they were.
Free for all.
Well, I just went straight to sea at 15.
You did no training, did you, or
No.
anything like that?
Right.
Home life weren't that good, to be quite honest, and so just got away. Because my brother come out of Borstal, and he went straight from Borstal to fishing. So when he packed up, I said, well, I'm going. Because he had plenty of money. Like I say, you go to sea for 2 or 3 weeks at £10, 18 shillings a week. If you made 23 or £3,300 to catch, you get that on top of your wages, isn't it? So you come ashore, you're only ashore 2 days. That's why they called us
3-day millionaires.
3-day millionaires, because you had plenty of money. All of them, I know you got a weekly wage on the trawlers, but the barges and the coasters, all the ones I were on a share. If you didn't do a cargo, you didn't get no money, and you paid for your own fuel as well. So if you going somewhere in ballast, then you're running for nothing. The ideal thing was to be running with a cargo to A and a cargo back from A to B, you know, so you're loaded all the time. Yeah. But otherwise, if you're in ballast, you're paying for your fuel.
What are you doing, Tim?
I'm pinning up the felt underneath this plank prior to spiling out and fitting the last plank.
Fantastic. So you're using roofing nails to put that felt in?
No. I'm using galvanised boat felt nails.
Are they more expensive than normal ones?
They certainly are, yes.
I thought they might be.
Like I say, when I come ashore, I don't know what. Well, I met Jill, and I think I'd had enough and all. Probably, you know, things were changing. When I come ashore and was courting Jill, and Jill ended up pregnant, and when we got married, we had nowhere to live. I hadn't got a bean. I'd been
poorly.
I'd been poorly. I hadn't got no money. I fortunately got a job at Bradwell Power Station, and so you know, you just had to keep working.
Yeah.
Didn't we?
We did.
Yeah,
we did.
Yeah.
We got there.
We used to go tater picking, strawberry picking.
Did you?
Didn't we?
Yeah. And then the year Bill finished, he decided he was finishing work at 60. I got my redundancy the same time. So we sold up and went round the world.
Do you miss it at all?
Every day.
Do you?
Yeah, I mean, because we're all friends on Facebook who were doing the same sort of thing, and there's always pictures on Facebook of old ships what we were on and that, you know. And
in the 80s, it was thought that the answer and the future for sailing barges was going to be company ownership. The Berwick was company owned. I forget which company had Berwick. Magnificently turned out. Full-time job for a skipper and mate. May, owned by Tate and Lyle. Magnificent. Plenty of money to look after it. Gladys, the same. Allied Foods, a massive company. Hydrogen was bought by Bell's Whiskey. Basically, a barge would arrive at a port, and every year local publicans would be invited for a free booze up, basically, on the barge. So Bell's Whiskey had a barge with Bell's written in the topsail and Scotch Whiskey written in the mainsail. Magnificent. So Steve, the full-time skipper, would always sit quietly over lunch with a tide table, work out the 6-7 month schedule. As we sailed, for instance, say you're sailing along the south coast, summer's day, past Brighton Beach, thousands of people. You go quite close inshore, and you've got Bell's Scotch Whiskey on the mainsail. Fantastic sight, bowsprit down, flying jibs, and we were close. You could see people, you could almost talk to them, you know. And you just thought, well, this is the future. This is companies can really, you know, fly the flag and promote themselves. But no, one day, I think it was about 1990. It was late 80s. Steve, the skipper, was called up to Perth, and they decided that was it. The accountants had told them if they didn't finance the barge, they could knock a halfpenny off the price of a bottle of whiskey. and that's the way they went. But as Steve said, where does the goodwill that Bells, when you think of all the Bells reps going into any pub all over England saying, come down to the barge, you'll be picked up by coach, delivered, returned home, all free, and the goodwill, well, where does that figure in the accounts? That's all invisible. But anyway, that was the end of hydrogen as a company barge, and so the Gladys is the only one that remains in company hands. In 1977 was the Queen's Silver Jubilee. Several barges were going to London for the procession on the Thames, and so that's the first time that we took Raybel back up the Thames as far as Tower Bridge and into St Catherine's Dock. So I was 16, still at school, and then we came out for the procession at the end of that week and moored up on Butler's Wharf, which was derelict warehouses, and the Truman Brewery was still working. Right through the 80s, the Truman Brewery was still making beer, and every week a brewer's dray would come over Tower Bridge and deliver beer to the city pubs of London.
With the horse?
With the horse. Two very splendid looking shire horses.
Fabulous.
With their brasses and bells and whatever.
Wow.
So we sat on Butler's Wharf for the procession with the Queen going past in the Royal Nor, which I think even locked into St Catherine's, or there was a walkway built, that's it, and she went and opened something in the dock. And there were a few sponsorships. Windsor and Newton sponsored the barge for several years. It was a little bit of money. There was a big canvas banner that went between the mainmast and the mizzenmast that said Windsor and Newton Artists Materials. So there were various sponsorships like that which helped, and it was quite common amongst barges that weren't company owned to have either something in the topsail or some kind of banner or flag. From the 80s we were doing less and less charters. I suppose with me having to make a living, it was really those times that I thought, well, there's so much time that, I mean, any barge is often idle for 6 months of the year, and it's a huge and magnificent interior, really. And that's when it occurred to me we could take the hatches off, unveil this kind of bar underneath. It must be possible to find some kind of income to help with the ever-increasing maintenance costs. And I think it was my interest in theatre, perhaps, that I've always had. Music, especially acoustic music. I'd met the band of the Hot Club of King's Cross, that 1930s musette, Django Reinhardt, Stefan Grappelli music, which they happened to do brilliantly well. The theatre and the Hot Club, especially as a 30s jazz band, that gradually became a regular event. So yes, it was earning something, but it was, I think more of the they were good experiences, really. It was good to be part of it.